Alrighty, so we can go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone so much for joining us for today's event on becoming a 2020 advocate. I'm so excited, and it's so incredibly important that my dear friend and basically right-hand woman, um, Laura Landsberg, has decided to put together for us, because really we're living in such crazy times. There's COVID, there's the upcoming election, there's questions on the election. How are we going to get our ballots in this year? Is it going to be absentee ballots? Is it going to be mail-in? Is it going to be in person? So all of these questions, I know I didn't have the answers to, and I still don't, but Alora is fortunately here to save us all, and she's going to keep us well informed. So Alora, take it away, my friend.
All right, thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. So I'm going to just briefly share my screen. Oh, hey, Somalia. All right, can you guys all see my screen right now?
Yes.
Fabulous. Let's go into slideshow view. All right, cool. So so today we're talking about becoming a 2020 advocate. This is essentially your guide to legislation, voter registration, and fighting COVID. And I don't think I need to tell anyone who's living in the year 2020 why 2020 has been such an important and tumultuous year. There's been a lot happening, and there's in the coming months there's going to be a lot of work to do to kind of set humanity essentially up for a really successful future. So there's kind of a lot to get through in this slide deck. So it's going to go into the different topics we have. So I'm going to start off with some welcomes and introductions. And then you want to talk a little bit before we get into the advocacy about just the recent updates on COVID-19 and where that stands, because that is really critical in both how we want to act going forward and setting us up for success in the future as just a people in society. Then we're going to go into contacting your legislature and your representatives, registering to vote, considerations for working the polls, how to be informed of the polls, and then other ways of getting involved. So to start off with, we're just going to do a brief round of introductions. And for this, we want to talk about your name, the state you're residing in, how you're feeling about the coming months, and what are you hoping to take away from this call. So Caroline, if you want to go first, I'm just going down my list.
Sure thing. So my name is Caroline Rakos-Wojciechowski. I am in New York State, where I'm registered to vote. And I'm feeling nervous about the upcoming months. There's a lot up in the air. There's a lot of political tension, we'll call it, up in the air. And it could go one way or the other. But more importantly, I feel like there's not enough talk going on, especially now when, we have both presidential candidates selected. They're the Democratic and Republican national conventions just took place, but there's not enough talk going on about how this is going to all go down, what the voting process is going to be like. And then on top of everything, just the US Postal Service is a mess right now. So I'm sure you'll also address that. So a little unsettled, I think, is the word that I would use to describe how I feel about the upcoming months, but hopefully some good things will come of it. And what am I hoping to take away? Just the knowledge to be able to make informed decisions on the voting process this particular cycle, and to be able to also teach others who aren't on this call, but who do want to exercise their right to vote.
I love it. Thank you so much. That was a lot of super important points, and we're gonna get to some of those definitely. Next on my list, I see Valeria. Do you want to go?
Sure. I'm also extremely worried about the upcoming elections and overall world situation, not just in the United States. So as you know, I'm from Belarus, and right now our elections already, so the country already chose the president, and our president won 80% of the votes, and it's just not true. And as you know, it's a last dictatorship in Europe, and our people are protesting against the government. And a lot of people have already died. because they just disagree with the falsification of the votes. Those are just not true. So, and I can see, I can actually relate this situation that is going on in my country and what's going on in the United States, because I can see that a lot of New Yorkers are definitely not supporters of Donald Trump, and there is a lot of protests going on against him and for the support of the African American community. And the situation here is just as unsafe and not calm, just like in my country. So I'm extremely worried, and I don't want the same situation happen in United States, just like in Belarus, that a lot of people would just disagree, just like they are right now about the president. So I really hope that people make a right choice, and we will all be safe and live in peace. That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah. Is there anything in particular you're hoping to take away from the call today?
Could you please repeat it?
Yeah. Is there anything you're hoping to take away from this call today in particular?
So in particular, I'm hoping that we will probably educate and educate people and show them what's going on right now during COVID-19, what's going on with the election situation, and make sure that people understand what choice is the right one. That is my hope.
Absolutely. And now, Somali, I want to finish this off.
Sure. Sorry. So yeah, my name is Somali Rose. I'm from New York, born and raised. I'm also registered to vote here. How am I feeling about the coming months? I feel a lot of things. I feel like when it comes to the economy, it's going to crash this coming November, regardless of who wins. If Trump wins, it will crash exponentially, but then rise back up come February. But if Joe Biden wins, it will crash, but not as exponentially, and it will gradually rise. Whereas if Trump wins, it will fall hard and rise back up hard. And then that's not necessarily a good thing in terms of it rising back up hard because Trump's in office. It would just show that it's basically a money game, and people are using the welfare of people's lives as basically a money grab, meaning that like people are voting to disenfranchise people, also that they can have a better economic standpoint in terms of like financial investing. But obviously the average person isn't savvy with that, so essentially they are throwing other people down to the wind just so that they can fill their own pockets up. In terms of who is going to win, I hope it's Joe Biden, but in my personal opinion, I don't think it matters who's wins because the U.S. is just not where it needs to be structurally. If Joe Biden wins, we're still going to have the same issues, the same systematic injustices, and unless we as a community fight to change that, then we're just basically going to be in the same rodeo where, you know, Joe wins, everybody thinks racism went away again, and then, you know, certain issues aren't going to be fixed. And if Joe does win, I don't see Trump taking it lightly or his supporters. I think everything's going to be very violent if Joe does win. And then the last question, my takeaway is just basically just to learn and like see what you have to present for us today.
All right.
Supporting you, of course.
Absolutely. Oh, thanks. But yeah, no, so those are all really great points. And it seems that across the board, we're all really stressed out. Definitely same here. It feels like we're in a pretty rough situation. And no matter how November goes down, it's still going to be a rough situation getting out of it. And like you guys all mentioned, really the point of this is to kind of like center us on like what's happening these few months and like what we can do to move forward to give us a really good, like, at the very least, you know, have strong advocacy towards the end of the year. So before we get started, I just want to make like a bit of a disclaimer. In the spirit of the UN, this conversation will be kept as nonpartisan as possible, at least from my perspective. Obviously, we all have different opinions, and like with the current climate, a lot of us have strong opinions in certain directions. But for right now, it's just about like educating everyone, and we'll try to keep like specific political sides out of this. Although, again, if we want to have that conversation offline, always happy to do that. And also, before we go into this, while this is about being an advocate, we're going to start off with a little bit of like a where are we now in our current situation? Because one of the biggest parts about being an advocate is obviously about being informed. And to start that off, we're going to talk about the current state of COVID-19. The reason why I want to talk about this is because while this year has been crazy with like states burning, countries burning, protests very justified, well, protests in the street that have been incredibly important for like, and movement for justice, and killer wasps and like near wars breaking out in like major countries. Like it's been a crazy year. COVID-19 is what's really the most historical thing and the biggest impact that we've seen. And what's really interesting, as I'm sure a lot of us have started to feel, is that, you know, we're in New York. We all were in New York at some point this year, and we saw how bad it was. We saw, some of us may have seen the like trucks that they had to use for the deceased. They may have like heard the like calls at 7 p.m. of I'm seeing on the doctors, and you don't hear that as much anymore. People are starting to go back outside. People are starting not to wear masks. They're trying to get back to normal. And what's interesting is when you actually look at where we are, you realize that we are not near normal yet. We're not near normal yet. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of work that needs to happen to get us back to normal. Because as you can see here, this data is just from like September 8th from the CDC, so only about 4 days ago. And even in a state like New York, which is doing pretty well compared to a lot of other states, we still had over 3,000 COVID cases reported just from September 2nd to September 8th. And while that may sound really great compared to where we were earlier, other countries who are actually starting to really move out of COVID-19, they're normally getting about, I think Australia was about 50 cases a day throughout the whole country. So seeing this many cases in states, I mean, you know, you look at Florida, Texas, California, it's 16,000 to 30,000, right? There's a lot of work. And as you can also see on the right, I've also included the numbers. I think this is just a really important thing to kind of remind us just the exact toll that's been happening here, because it's really easy to get a bit complacent and a bit like, oh, everything's going back to normal, I'm so excited, and then not recognize the literal body count that's been happening here. So the numbers for the US are, I think, like 3 days old, so they've gone up since. But right, we have over 6 million cases that are known. It's probably it's predicted that that's probably missing a number of cases that are either people not going to the doctor because they didn't have that many symptoms, or may have been misdiagnosed, and almost 200,000 deaths just in the US. That is more deaths than, that is considerably more deaths than there were in the US during World War I, just as a bit of context. Because I feel like it's really hard to kind of think about the death toll and the impact this has had when you're only seeing the numbers. And I feel like kind of making this relative to like, this is the kind of toll you'd see in a huge world war. Because when you look at the global statistics, right, it's approaching 1 million deaths. So COVID-19 has been a terrible time. We are still in the midst of it. And a lot of the context for what's going to happen in the next few months is, this is the backdrop. It's this decisions we make here and now will determine how this country, how this world is able to move forward after COVID. Because the Spanish influenza had 3 separate waves, and a lot of the world hasn't even finished wave 1 yet. So this is a serious issue. To talk about things that need to get done during COVID, we have a bit of a like rough timeline. It's not a month-by-month timeline. It's kind of like a where we were in the beginning and where we are now and where we need to get to. So in early 2020, this is around March, we were getting about 30,000 COVID-19 cases a day in the country, and we had 22 million Americans unemployed because of the quarantine. Obviously, that meant a lot of people weren't getting paid, and a lot of people really had nowhere to go. And so, as we all kind of know, Congress acted. they put into place the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or the CARES Act. And for those who don't know, this resulted in every U.S. adult who's making less than $90,000 a year getting up to $1,200 through a government check. Minors would be given a check for minors of about $500. $650 billion were given out in small business loans in order to make sure that people were able to kind of keep their employees on payroll for as long as possible. And there was also a COVID-19 relief fund to cover medical services. So this was approved March 27th, so kind of early on, to really help people through COVID. However, it is no longer March, it is now September, and a lot of things have changed. I have the changes here. So a positive-ish, the unemployment rate has gone down since March. In April it was 14.7% of the US who was unemployed. It has now dropped since July down to 10.2. So it's a good drop, it's moving in the right direction. But of course, that's prefaced on the fact that in February, we only had about 3.5% unemployment. So the unemployment essentially almost tripled since February. So that's still millions of Americans who are not employed. What we have on the bottom in the middle of 2020 is where we are with COVID now as well. And you can kind of see how the graph has changed over time, where in March, when the first kind of COVID relief act was put in place, we said we were getting about 30,000 cases a day. That was horrifying, terrible, led to all the quarantines. And since then, it has largely gotten worse. You can see June, July, we were hitting about 60, 70,000 cases a day. As of yesterday, there were 43,000 cases. So essentially, this bill that was used in March, which is supposed to kind of provide a bit of short-term relief, was for a time that was, depending on the month, half as bad as the month we've seen recently. And as I'm sure a lot of you guys may know, there hasn't been another relief bill that's been passed since. In the middle, around like June, they tried to pass the HEROES Act. It was appealed. I'm not even sure there was a vote. And then actually, just 2 days ago, on Thursday, there was another legislative response in the form of the Delivering Immediate Relief to America's Family, Schools, and Small Businesses Act. So this came into Congress not too long ago, presented by the Republican Party, and it was meant to restart the extra unemployment benefits, so it increased it by $300 to what it was today, give COVID-19 liability services to ease any like legal burdens on businesses and schools, create an educational stabilization fund to like help schools start to reopen. They were also going to give a $10 billion USPS grant to assist with the post office, and additional funds for the COVID relief fund to help pay for medical services. And this was struck down on Thursday. Again, not going to give like any necessarily opinions on this, but that's essentially the state of where we are now. This is the second big bill that has been brought to Congress in an attempt to give more COVID relief, and it hasn't been brought in yet. And there are concerns that, as Somali may have mentioned earlier, as we did mention earlier, if there isn't another relief fund given soon, it's going to just cause a lot of stress in the American public. There already is a lot of stress. And the Congress's goal is there needs to be a bill by the end of this year, because as you saw, COVID isn't going anywhere anytime fast. And we have a lot of work to do if we're going to jumpstart our economy, make sure people have their homes, have food on the table. So that's where we're at. And with all of this kind of in mind, both the problems this is causing and where Congress is right now, it's really important that people allow their voices to be heard, so that Congress understands that COVID needs to be a priority and this bill can't wait, because we've been waiting. And as the numbers have shown, we don't have a lot of time to wait anymore as a nation and as just a people. So what are some ways that you can make your voice heard? So this is a photo from back in the before times when going outside was a thing. I know at least a few of you have done this before, when you have UNA USA with the Day of Action, and they're lobbying in DC. And while lobbying is no longer in-person lobbying, it's not something that you see very much anymore, there are still ways to kind of talk to your local officials in order to just make sure they know that you're concerned about this and what you kind of see and what you want to prioritize when they're going forward with COVID relief. So there were a few steps that I have outlined here that you can do to kind of, get in touch with your officials and make sure your voice is heard. The first thing is to just find your local official. A lot of people don't know who the local official is. There's a lot of them. It's really frustrating. So what you can do is go to this website, usa.gov/elected officials, and there are tons of links there where if you just put in your zip code, it'll show you your local officials. So, and if you're in a big district, kind of the way I am, for example, I live in Lower Manhattan, where there are 3 different representatives in a very small area. You put in your exact address, and they'll be able to tell you who your local representative is. So that's a really helpful tool to just, finish that first step. After that, go to the website. It is a representative's job to talk to the constituents, so they make sure there are tons of ways that you can reach out to them. They'll have their email, their social media, their phone number for their office, all posted in very obvious places, and so you'll be able to get in touch with them. And then from there, you really want to decide what your preferred contact method will be for your representative. So the first 2, pretty easy. Email them, kind of telling them about your concerns, what you want to see happen in the next few months in terms of like the bills that matter to you. Also the phone numbers as well. You can call them. You might not get the representative themselves. You normally don't, but you could end up getting one of their staff members who will either answer your question directly, or direct you to where you can get more like help with your question, your query. You can also do a written letter. Postcarding is a really popular thing. You write a postcard, you send it to your local representative, someone will read it. And especially if it gets a lot of attention, the same issue gets a lot of attention, they'll normally move forward with it. Then there's also another thing which I don't think a lot of people, at least not a lot of people I've met do, which is actually attend town halls. So most representatives, it's a lot of the ones that I've been around, will have an email list that you can join, an email list and a phone number list, and they'll have monthly or semi-monthly town halls, which at this point are now virtual calls where you can kind of talk to your representative and say what you're worried about, what you want to see changed, and you'll get a notification. Well, at least, so for example, for my representative in Lower Manhattan, I'll get, for example, a text or even sometimes a voicemail saying, hey, there's a town hall meeting coming up, would you like to attend? And you can attend and have your voice heard that way as well. So those are some of the methods that are available to get in touch with your legislation. Then there are also some tips and tricks. So based on some polls, it seems that email is often the preferred method to contacting your representative, because if it's something that they find really important, they can just CC whoever's on their staff who'd be the best to address it. They're also more likely to respond to personalized messages than letter forms. So a letter form is something you may have seen before. It's when you are with an organization normally and they kind of create a template for your email, and then they just send it out to a bunch of people and say, forward this off. A lot of representatives, when they see that, while it can bring their attention to an issue, it normally isn't nearly as impactful as actually having personalized, written out messages normally involving why it's so important to you uniquely, or some kind of normally anecdotes as well are very powerful to getting representatives to really focus on something. So that's one thing to think about. For some issues, yes, letter forms are powerful. If you can get a few hundred postcards sent or a few thousand emails sent, that could garner some really positive attention. But especially if you don't have those numbers, a personalized message, a personalized email can really go a long way. Another thing is office hours. So a lot of representatives have office hours that they'll post on their website or through their social media pages. And those are just open times where they can just allow their constituents to come in and talk to them. It can be really powerful. I've had friends who've reached out during office hours and then ended up being put on a group to actually address themselves and work with their staff and work with the rep themselves to address a serious issue in the community. So right now, office hours aren't quite as common because of quarantine, but especially once things open up again, it's always a great option. And it's also nice to kind of get your foot into the door and talk to them, especially once quarantine's over, face to face. And then my last tip and trick is it's always easier with friends. If you want to go talk to a representative and you're kind of nervous, bring a friend on the line with you. If you just need someone to motivate you to get the emails done, have some time with a friend, even just over Zoom because you're trying to keep, social distancing. Put on some music in the background while you're Zooming and start sending emails. So these are just some things that you can do to really make sure your voice is heard, especially as legislation is changing in these next few months. So then from there, I'm going to move into something a little bit different, which is voting. Because let's say you're like, no, I don't want to do voter registration, or excuse me, I don't really want to engage my representatives at that level. Or even if you do want to engage and have been engaging with them, which is also super important, is voting. We all know that, you know, it's 2020, voting is coming up, and it is so important that everyone votes. I mean, I know the people on this call, but like a lot of people who are probably watching this, we've seen in just the past 20 years how a few hundred votes can make a humongous difference in an election. So every single vote does count, regardless of the state you're in, regardless of the electoral college votes that are like around, regardless of, you know, whether your state always votes in a certain way, you need to vote. And so this is some information to really help with all of that. First of all, check your voter registration status. You can go to voterlookup.elections.newyork.gov, and they will, you know, you put in some of your information to tell you if you've registered, and the site will also help tell you what your election district numbers are, your county district, your assembly district, and whatnot. So essentially, it'll tell you the number associated with your district, and with that, you can go and find your legislator a bit easier as well. Then there's also the important thing about knowing the registration deadlines. So this is actually really important, especially because this works a bit differently than it does in other countries. And I know in other countries, they'll sometimes have registration deadlines all the way up to the day of. You can register to vote on the day of voting. In America, not true. So in New York, the deadline to register to vote through an online portal is Friday, October 9th. So if you like go into like, and I have the description in the link is in the speaker notes, and I'll send these slides out to everyone so you'll be able to see it. But essentially, you go onto an online portal and register to vote. It's super simple, super easy, as long as you do it before October 9th. Then if you don't want to go online, let's say you have a bad internet connection wherever you are, you can also do voter registration through the mail. And for that, you just have to make sure that your voter registration is postmarked by, again, Friday, October 9th, and it needs to be received by the Board of Elections by October 14th. And again, there's a link in the slide deck that shows you how to get the addresses of your Board of Elections, at least in New York. Then there's also, as was mentioned earlier, absentee ballots, and we'll have a whole slide on that because that's really interesting. The deadline to apply for an absentee ballot is online, at least through an online portal, is October 27th. And that date is actually kind of funny, so remember that date. So yeah, that's for the deadline when you go online to get that done. And then you can actually, this is what's a bit interesting, you can apply for an absentee ballot in person up to November 2nd. But you have to do it in person, so if you're not in your state, that can get a bit more difficult. And then so the final point there is essentially, how do you want to vote? And this isn't about what candidate you're going to vote for. This is about what method you want to use. So this is, do you want to vote in person on November 3rd? Do you want to vote early? The early voting period is from October 24th to Sunday, November 1st. Or do you want to vote by mail? And if you do, what is the best way of going about that? So I know I just like a whole lot of information. I've been talking a lot. So before we go into the specifics of voting by mail, I just want to take a brief pause and see if there's any questions. Cool. Sounds like there aren't. Awesome. All right, so now we can get into the interesting thing, which is what to consider for mail-in ballots. So mail-in ballots are interesting, and they're even more interesting now. So I'll start off with the pros, and then I can kind of explain what this weird wonky looking graphic is on the right, and then how that translates to the cons. So the pros of mail-in ballots, obviously, that they're, well, at least one of the big ones, is that they're more convenient. If you're in a different state for school, for work, or as is very true during quarantine, because you might have like flown home to be with family or whatnot, mail-in ballots allow you to vote in a different state, even in a different country. You don't have to wait in lines, you don't have to miss work or anything. And what's also really great about mail-in ballots is that you can change your mind later. So if you happen to register for a mail-in ballot and then say, actually, nah, never mind, I want to do it in person, you can still just, you don't have to do anything else. You just go to your polling place and vote there. And the biggest thing about why mail-in ballots are so important this year is because obviously there's less risk of contracting COVID-19 if you're voting by mail than if you're waiting in line with a few hundred to 1,000 other people, depending on where you are. So normally, you need to have like a legitimate excuse for using a mail-in ballot or an absentee ballot. Legitimate being like you're in a hospital, you are literally physically unable to get to a polling place, you are in another state, in another country. But essentially because of COVID-19, everyone is just allowed to use it because most people take it very seriously because COVID is a legitimate excuse in itself, is a legitimate reason to want to do an absentee ballot. So everyone has the ability to apply for mail-in ballot. Where things get complicated is the USPS recently got a new postmaster general, and in the aftermath, a lot of budget cuts have been made for the USPS. A lot of the sorting machines have been taken down. A lot of the places where they would drop mail, pick up mail have no longer exist. Staff has been cut. So it's been really difficult to keep up with demand. And it's always a bit difficult for the US Postal Service to keep up with demand, but now it's even harder. And so what's happening on the right is the USPS actually released a statement talking about how they're very concerned about being able to handle the load of mail-in ballots, and gave essentially each state a rating of increased risk of those postal delays. So anything that's in the darker orange, there was a very high risk that they will not be able to handle just even normal mail, and there'll be more delays. And as you'll notice, New York is definitely on that list because we are a big state. And that leads to some very serious potential issues and considerations for if you were going to do mail-in voting. So the first one is probably also the most important, is that there will be tighter deadlines for you. So the deadline, the official deadline for postmarking a mail-in ballot is November 3rd. However, that ballot must be received by the Board of Electors by November 10th. So, it's like 7 days that it should take to get your ballot from when you send it off to the Board of Electors, which can be difficult if you're in a different state. But in the situation, that could even not be guaranteed when you're in the same city. In fact, the USPS said that it cannot guarantee delivery of a ballot in time if it is not sent within 15 days of the deadline. What's really interesting about that is that means that you essentially have to send in your mail-in ballot by October 27th to get anything close to a guarantee that it will actually end up getting to the Board of Electors in time. As you might notice, the day to send in your mail-in ballot is essentially the same day as a deadline to register to get a mail-in ballot. So for a lot of people, especially those who wait until the deadline, they may actually just get the mail-in ballot before it's so late that it wouldn't even be possible for the USPS to get it to the Board of Electors in time, which would mean their vote just wouldn't be counted. And this is like a serious issue, and a lot of people don't realize how big they're anticipating the deadline to be. So if you're planning on doing an absentee ballot, you really had to plan in advance. And honestly, like, the idea is if you want to do this, you should apply for mail-in ballot now and send it off as soon as you're able, because it can take a very long time for them to get it where it needs to be. In fact, a interesting anecdote during the primary, my partner and I both applied for absentee voting. He applied a few days earlier than me, and his mail-in ballot never came. It never even came to his own address to send off. It still hasn't come. If it exists, it definitely never made it. Thankfully, again, we're very lucky and privileged to be healthy young individuals. He was able to go to his polling place to vote in person, but that is one of the big uncertainties you end up facing if you're planning on doing a mail-in ballot. The uncertainty is, will that mail-in ballot even arrive at your home in time for you to send it? I know my mail-in ballot essentially came the day before I needed to send it. as well, which is also a little bit concerning, because a few more hours and I probably wouldn't have made it. There's also the concern of whether or not it'll make it to the Board of Electors in time for it to be counted. Because if it misses that deadline, it'll be a pretty uncertain argument as to whether or not that'll be counted. So those are some really just important things to think about. And I want to just pause here for a little bit to see if any of you guys have any reactions, thoughts, concerns. I know this is kind of an interesting point. And if not, that is also all good. All right. So then going from this, we also have a very important point of working the polls. So one of the really big points about being a poll worker is, it helps control the line. It helps make sure that people are able to vote safely, securely, and confidentially. And this photo that I chose on the right was not just by happenstance. I chose this photo very deliberately because historically, over half of New York's poll workers are over the age of 60. And I mean, these lovely people on the right definitely look very happy and sort of very sprightly, but they're not quite as young as they once were. So for these individuals, it can be really difficult for them to be able to go out and work the polls because they're incredibly vulnerable to COVID-19. So the polls are really trying to push hard to get other people, younger, healthier people who don't have pre-existing conditions, to help step up and work the polls. Of course, COVID-19 is kind of, yes, it does impact older generations more, but anyone can get it, anyone can die from it. So if you are a younger, healthier person who wants to work the polls or is even considering it, there are a lot of things you need to consider before signing up. And I have just a few of the ones listed here to think about. The first one is, do you live with people who are at risk? If you're living with an elderly relative or someone who has a compromised immune system or someone with a pre-existing condition like asthma or any number of other pre-existing conditions, you really need to stop and ask, not just yourself, but also the person you live with, what their comfort level is with you working at the polls. Because it could be that if you go and work at the polls and try to do something good for your city, you could end up endangering the life of someone who you really care about. In the same vein, I also asked your roommates. Like we mentioned, a lot of people have kind of been getting a bit more comfortable in our current situation, a bit less worried about COVID. But that's not true of everyone. A lot of people are very concerned. It doesn't necessarily need to be just because of a pre-existing condition. It can also just be a significant concern. It's very justified to be concerned about COVID. So if you do live with anyone, you want to make sure you have a very open conversation about whether or not they'd be comfortable with you doing this. Also, just check in with yourself. Are you healthy? If you have a fever, if you're coughing, if you're sneezing, probably don't want to work at the polls. Definitely don't, because it's important that you're also healthy so that you don't end up infecting everyone else there as well. And also, just when talking about health, you don't just mean are you healthy in terms of do you have COVID or not, but also are you like physically healthy? If you are healthier, there's a slightly less risk of getting COVID and getting it not getting COVID, but of getting it in a way that could lend to hospitalization. So just kind of check in with yourself and say, do I feel like my body is in a place where I might not be as concerned? Again, that's a very difficult question to ask because COVID can kind of impact anyone in a way that isn't very predictable. And that's why one of the other important things you need to consider is, do you have easy access to testing? Because if you're going to work the polls, you should really get tested beforehand to make sure, again, that, are you in good shape? Are you going to end up infecting everyone else? And also afterwards. After working the polls, you should get tested again because that's a densely populated area. And you don't want to just assume because you don't feel too badly, you haven't gotten COVID and end up accidentally infecting a ton of people afterwards. Another question is, will you be in a densely populated area soon after the election? Because if you're working the polls and they're going to be surrounded by people, that could be another concern as well. If you've kind of taken this list and any other thoughts in mind, you're like, yes, I am healthy. Yes, I am not going to negatively impact any of my housemates or family members by working, even if I do happen to get COVID. Yes, I have access to testing. And then I've included some of the steps here to become a poll worker. So you can apply at the website here. I say apply because I do have to approve you, but with the need that they have, they're pretty open to accepting people. Then you can choose a preferred job, and which includes assisting voters, setting up a polling site, processing voters. There's a whole bunch of other ones as well. And then you are actually compensated. You're compensated $280 per day. It's per day because while a lot of the work is on November 3rd, they also have days beforehand to help out with like people voting early and any kind of setup and processing before that. And the 280 a day, I know that isn't very significant, but it's more just to make sure that like your help is acknowledged and to make it easier for people who aren't able, who might have issues with work. Oh yeah. So yeah, Somalia. To answer your question, essentially there is a website called elections.newyork.gov/become poll worker. But I will send out this deck afterwards and to make sure everyone has it, and then you can just go and click the link. Essentially, it's a pretty quick form you fill out, and then you'll get an email saying that you're confirmed to have applied, and they'll get back to you afterwards saying which polling place you're going to go to help out on. Yeah. So then we come to you've learned how to talk to your legislature, you've learned how to vote, you've learned what to consider to work the polls, and then we come to, if my slide work, taking your engagement to the next level. So this is essentially just like a whole bunch of resources that you can use to both become an informed voter and engage in various virtual volunteering. So one of the big questions that I've gotten, and I actually gotten this especially from people who didn't grow up studying history or didn't grow up even in like America, who really want to know what's happening with elections. And honestly, I should be getting this question more from just people who grew up here too and who did study history because in social studies, because a lot of people don't really know what the representatives stand for. In fact, it can be really difficult to figure out what your representative's voting record is. During the primary, I know I was looking things up about the people who were going to be on my ballot, and I was struggling to find anything. But thankfully, there are some sources that are really great for helping with that. One of them is called govtrack.us/Congress/votes. You go to this website, and essentially you can filter out by each congressional session and look up the ballot, the legislation that was up for voting. And it'll have every single piece of legislation that was voted on by that entire Congress. You click on that, and not only will that take you to a summary of the bill, but it'll tell you how each and every representative voted on that bill, split by Senate and House of Representatives. And this is really important because it makes sure that you're able to keep your representatives honest and keep them accountable. Because if there are bills that are incredibly important to you, and the representative in your area isn't voting for them, you can check that. You can go and check and see what they're voting on. I know that I did this in June when there were a lot of bills coming out about like police accountability. And I went on and checked and saw like who's voting for these bills and like if they're not getting passed, who's responsible for that. Another thing too is local representatives. So the govtrack.us, that's only for your federal level, House of Representatives, and Senate. But Ballotpedia will be able to break these down for you by your local legislative members as well. So this one has the 2020 New York legislative session. That's what's in this link. And if you go there, it'll kind of show you the most recent bills that representatives in New York voted on. And it's the same thing. You click on the link for the bill. It'll show you what the bill's description was and who voted for what. And the data from Ballotpedia comes from billtrack50.com, and that has a whole bunch of bills throughout like the entire session, split by local region and who voted on them. And it can be kind of time consuming, but also, I'll be honest, it's kind of fun to kind of go and find the bills that you really care about and then see who's supporting them. And it really helps to inform your vote, because I know that when I used to vote back in like 2016 election, I didn't even really consider my local representatives. And now I think everyone should really find it really important to make sure that the local reps are also supporting your own goals. And then finally, we have one of the things that I also think is really important, especially right now for 2020, which is engaging in virtual volunteering and other levels of advocacy, because voting is important and everyone should do that. And reaching out to a local legislator is also important. And I think once you feel more comfortable about it, definitely feel free to do it. But there are a whole bunch of other ways that you can get involved. One of the ways that I've found, as I mentioned earlier, was joining a mailing list of a representative or congressman or woman who you find like you agree with their ideas, you agree with their policies. And if you join their mailing list, they'll often have things about how you can get involved, how you can help support them. And that's like a nice way of kind of learning about any phone banking, text banking you can do if that's something that you're interested in. There are also a lot of things that aren't representative based about just getting out the vote. So we have some here, such as rockthevote.org, the When We All Vote, and the League of Women Voters, which is one of the like oldest organizations there. And essentially these are all like nonpartisan, like nonprofits, and you join, they'll have volunteering opportunities, and they'll help you essentially find different ways to volunteer to make sure people are registered to vote and have the information, a lot of which is like kind of presented here on the best ways to like get the information they need about registration deadlines, how to vote, and whatnot. And again, they have a lot of online or virtual opportunities because people aren't standing in the street helping people get registered to vote the way they used to. And then if you have like particular campaigns that you're interested in, again, I'm not going to endorse any politician over another or any congressman over another, but there are a lot of volunteering opportunities if you do have people in mind. So for example, sites like Mobilize, when you go on there, they just have a whole bunch of opportunities to kind of, for mobilization, for getting people together to do acts of advocacy. And if you have a candidate or someone in mind that you want to work with, you can just type in their name, and then a lot of opportunities will come up for you to do engagements on their behalf and volunteer on their behalf. And what's nice is that you'll often sign up with a whole bunch of other people, so you don't really feel alone. Even if you're on Zoom, you might have other people who are text banking with you on a Zoom, or other people who you know will be phone banking, so you feel like, okay, I'm not alone in this. The same thing goes with the app Outvote. Outvote is less based on your individual representatives and more based on organizations. It's a mobile app that you download, you join an organization, and that organization will have different actions. And each action will be like text people about X, Y, or Z, send out this email about this issue that's coming up that people to know about, and you can sync it to your contacts and just send it out to people via email, via text. And that's really helpful to just kind of get the word out and like help mobilize. And I do believe you can even make your own actions on Outvote. So if there's something that you're really passionate about, you can make your own group, invite your friends, and have everyone kind of work together through that. And then so there's a whole bunch of other opportunities. A lot of them, they're a bit easier to find if you have a representative in mind. So if you have someone you want to work with, you just Google them, their name, and then say volunteer. And then once that happens, like all these opportunities will come up, and you can just join through that. It can be a little bit intimidating to kind of work in this kind of field, the volunteering. And you'd also probably want to check with your own organization to make sure that's covered as well. There are certain like financial institutions, for example, that have policies against certain levels of political involvement. So you want to make sure that's been cleared. But if it is, these are just opportunities you can use to get more involved. And then you also have like more interesting ones that I found. Just like, for example, Indeed. Indeed isn't just for job postings, they also have volunteering opportunities, and you'll find a lot of like grassroots volunteering opportunities there as well. Yeah, so those are essentially all of the big thoughts for right now. And since I want to leave you guys with this last thought of, your vote is your voice is your power is real. And just want to caveat that, but it's not just about your vote, you have a lot of other actions you can do to make sure that you are heard, and so you can make a really positive impact towards these last few months, because 2020 is going down in history as one of the most just intense and impactful years on record in recent history. And I think it's really all up to us to stand up and be a positive impact and a positive force in this critical moment in history. But with that, that's really all I have to say. So I'd love to hear any questions you guys have in our last few minutes here. And if not questions, just any other comments. And again, I will send this deck out afterwards so everyone has it. And if you want to, forward it to anyone else, definitely feel free to do that as well. actually, please do. Please forward it to anyone who needs it. That is like one of the big things about this presentation was making something that had all this consolidated information.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Alura, for extremely useful information. Me as a non-American, I didn't even know so many things about voting. So for me, it was extremely new and knowledgeable and useful. So thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. I'm glad that was helpful.
Very helpful.
I'm glad.
Awesome. So I think if there are no more questions, we can go ahead and wrap that up.
All right, fantastic.
So I just want to say thank you, as echoing Valeria. Thank you so much, Alora, for putting this deck together. This was really informative, I know, for me, for Valeria, and I know to anyone else who is going to read through this and watch this presentation, even once we post it on the website, because it is, like you said, going to be one of the most impactful and important elections of our time. And I think exactly what this slide is saying. Your vote is your voice, your voice is your power, and your power is real. I think we can all get behind that message.
I'm really glad to hear it. And yeah, I'm just really glad that this was helpful, and I hope that we can just keep spreading knowledge and, you know, make a huge impact at the end. I got too excited. Yeah, I'm just hoping we can make a really big impact at the end of the year. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.